Well, any list of great heavyweights begins with the name Jack Jhonson, whose spectacular career dominated boxing in the early 1900s. Jhonson's style in and out of the ring marked him as one of the most controversial figures in the history of sports. Jack Jhonson became the first black heavyweight champion in 1908. Don Dunphy narrates a look back at his life and times.
There was an era when President Teddy Roosevelt promised the American public a square deal, and Henry Ford's assembly line turned out the first Model Ts. There was a time when Carrie Nation and her women's temperance union members used their axes to destroy saloons in their battle against demon rum. And the ship that could never sink, the Titanic, sailed from Southampton Harbor and was lost at sea 5 days later with a loss of over 1,500 lives. Overseas, the war to end all wars, World War I, was beginning to erupt in Europe. And at home, the problem was not between nations, but between races, where despite the end of slavery, segregation was still the law of the land, and the world of sports was no exception. In the early 1900s, a young black man out of Galveston, Texas, named Jack Jhonson, established himself as the leading heavyweight contender, and he refused to accept the unwritten rule that no black man would be allowed to fight for the heavyweight crown. Jhonson pursued champion Tommy Burns across 3 continents, and in 1980 finally got his chance in Sydney, Australia. After 14 one-sided rounds, with Burns absorbing a terrible beating and Johnson's taunts, the police stepped in right here, stopped the cameras, and seconds later stopped the fight. Johnson's historic victory unleashed a wave of hatred against the new champion, who infuriated the public by humiliating his opponents and flaunting a lifestyle which offended the conventions of white society, including taking a succession of 3 white wives. A series of great white hopes failed to produce a serious challenger, and when Jhonson destroyed former champion James J. Jeffries, the hatred boiled over into race riots across the country that resulted in many deaths. 2 years later, a trumped-up morals conviction caused Jhonson to jump bail and flee the country, vowing never to return. After losing his title in 1915 to Jess, Willard in Havana, he spent 5 more years in exile before finally turning himself into the authorities at the Mexican border. After his release, he continued boxing until the age of 50 and actually fought exhibitions when he was 67. He died a year later at the age of 68 in a car accident.
Mike, it seems sometimes that Jack Johnson's exploits out of the ring obscure the fact that at his best he was a superb athlete and considered by many the best defensive fighter in the sport.
Absolutely. I also was intrigued by his boxing style because at a particular time fighters were throwing the one devastating or 2 punches at a time, and that's the period when Jack Jhonson had the calm sense of anticipation and was catching the punches in the air, and it was just unbelievable watching it.
Well, let's take a look at that style and go back to July 4th, 1910, as James J. Jeffries, the former champion, came out of 6 years retirement to go up against the great Jack Jhonson.
And here we are right here with Jack Jhonson being very calm and cautious in the first round. He knows he had 45 rounds for this fight. He's about to tie Jeffries' hands behind his back as if he was a rag doll, and here he's doing so right here. Unbelievable power in Jack Jhonson.
Jhonson really was a safety-first fighter, Mike. He never took any unnecessary chances.
Absolutely, because in watching Jack Jhonson fight, he reminds me of a cat playing games with a mouse. And as we're about to see right here, Jeffries tied, and the game is over.
And, of course, back then, no neutral corner rules, so Jhonson could stand right over his man, waiting to pounce on him, as he is right here.
And by the time of the second knockdown, Jeffries was just totally exhausted here. Oh, man.
And coming up here, one of the most unusual incidents in heavyweight history, as the Jeffries corner and some of the media at ringside actually helped the former champion back on his feet, but they just delayed the inevitable.
And here we go right here, Jhonson showing the mark of a great champion, finishing off his opponent.
That Jeffries win was really the highlight of Johnson's career. Let's move forward 5 years to Havana, Cuba. A 37-year-old Jack Jhonson at the end of his career in round 21 of a scheduled 45-round bout against Jess, Willard.
Yes, and Jhonson at this point throwing combinations which are unheard of at this time, 1915. But I think this effort had just made Jhonson totally exhausted. Here we are in round 26. Watch for the Willard right hand. Oh.
And watch for one more thing. Look at Jack Johnson's legs. Right there at the count of 4, they relaxed. And really that marked the end of the era of Jack Jhonson. Mike, in the years after the Willard fight, Jack Jhonson claimed that he threw the fight. What's your opinion?
Well, it's very difficult for me to believe that, Alex, because it was a hot, scorching sun in Havana at that time, and Jhonson had fought with all his heart and soul for 26 rounds, and I could believe he could have made it a great deal easier on both of them if he'd have went down in the first round and lasted 26 rounds.